Hey everybody, Quantum here, and in this video I wanted to break down what was essentially our only big tournament over the December 28th, 29th weekend, and that was the Southside Gaming 8 case tournament. Not surprising, we didn't have too much this weekend since it is between Christmas and New Year's, but this is basically our only big tournament that we're going to have between now and when the North American Continentals come up. We might have one more weekend, but again, because we're so close between Christmas and New Year's, I'm not sure how many players will show up. But we did have almost 100 in this one, which is a pretty good representation. You know, eight cases is a lot. Congratulations to Ruby Amethyst for taking it, the only one in top 8. Before we jump into the deck list, I do want to note here that when you take a look at this top 8 spread, all 4 steel decks, 2 amber steel, 2 amethyst steel, fell to some combination of sapphire and or ruby decks, because 3 out of the top 4 were ruby and 3 out of the top 4 were also sapphire. The one anomaly being the Sapphire Amethyst, which I'm excited to take a look at here. So let's go ahead and jump straight in. To start off, we have Ruby Amethyst, showing once again why it continues to be a dominant force in the metagame since set 1, winning this tournament, so congratulations to Mr. Casey there. But we've got 3 Chernobyls, 3 Magic Brooms, and 2 Moanas. Very interesting 1-drop spread. 4 Flynn Riders on 2 and 4 Madam Mim Snake. So again, pretty standard stuff. What I will say, and what would be interesting to know, is obviously this player had to face up against probably some kind of steel decks in Swiss, but also in top 8, eliminating one of them. And what's interesting is steel, basically amber, you have to worry about the Cindy into Storm Rage. Now, obviously, you can mitigate that if you were on the play, and on the play for 2 out of the 3 games, you're not necessarily getting blown out completely by Cindy Storm, and that's again assuming that they have it on turn 1 when they are on the play. But also against Amethyst Steel, you know, Fire the Cannons also kind of disrupts your play, because out of these 1 and 2 drops, you have 16 in total. 12 of them get completely blown out by the steel cards, and then if your 1-drop gets blown out by a steel card, whether that's Cindy Storm and or Fire the Cannons, it turns off your snake because you have nothing to bounce back, right? So early on, you can lose a lot of tempo just by the steel decks blowing you out with those very cheap, you know, either Song and or Fire the Cannons, right? Those cheap actions. So it's interesting to see that Ruby Amethyst is still winning tournaments, because I think the prevalence of those steel decks and how fast that they basically are engineered now, right? Like Amber Steel, we've seen kind of shift to a very aggro focused deck, and even because of that, it has a better matchup into its worst matchup historically, which is Ruby Sapphire. And as a consequence to that, Ruby Amethyst suffers a little bit. But again, seeing that it's able to come out here is really nice. What's interesting is an adaptation. We don't really see Crab too much in Ruby Amethyst anymore, but I really do like this card. I think this is one of the tempo, one of the cards that can claw back tempo for you, which I think Ruby Amethyst needs to play as much as possible. I've even been looking at playing Diablo 1-drop in this build, so that, you know, if they want to Storm Rage or Fire the Cannons my Diablo 1-drop, go ahead, I'll draw a card. Otherwise, I have fodder for my snake on turn 2, and then maybe instead of even playing Flynn Rider, go for something like a Madam Mim Tiny Adversary, because it's a 0/3. But again, I'll save that for the deep dive video on Ruby Amethyst that I'll do maybe a little bit later. We've seen the Moana into Flynn combination occur in the European Championship as well, so that's nothing new. Aside from that, the only other kind of small anomalies is 2 rabbits instead of 3, which is understandable. I've talked about being 4 and 3 for the genie and rabbit kind of being the accepted ratio, but in a faster format, you may want to cut rabbit for a crab, and I can understand that. You still have a lot of draw power, right? Genie replaces itself 2 rabbits if you can protect them, if you know how to play through the deck, right? It requires you to play a little bit more cleanly, I guess you can say. Like, you know, when you play 3 rabbits, you can afford to say, okay, I've got another rabbit in hand, I can kind of do what I want with this one, quest with it, let my opponent challenge it, draw extra cards, and then just deploy the second one and start protecting the second one. But with only 2 rabbits, it might be a little bit more dicey. You might have to play to protect this, again, depending on the scenarios that you're in, if you need to generate, if this is your main form of a card draw engine. You still play 4 friends though, and again, the 4 genie, so it's still a lot of ways to generate advantage, plus your 1-drops, if they survive and are able to proc their abilities, will replace themselves as well. We've got 2 Bell. I think this is also pretty standard in this list by now. I've talked about this since the European Championship. 2 Bell feels amazing in this deck. I can't tell you how many matches I've won by surprising my opponent with like Elsa, tap down, throw it into something, next turn Bell, move the Elsa damage. Like, it's so good. Oh my goodness, that like this interaction here is literally potentially, especially into the aggro decks, game-winning plays. Into the Ruby Sapphire decks, not so much, but you already have a good matchup into Ruby Sapphire, so it's, you know, not too significant. But these interactions, like the belt interactions, could be some of the reasons why this player was able to claw back a lot of advantage against the aggro decks, despite maybe losing the early game. It would be interesting to see what their thoughts were if they ever do an interview on their tournament run here. We only see 2 Mauis, 2 Lady Tremaines, and 2 Madame Medusa. On the upper end removal package, this is a very interesting spread that people are opting for now. I've talked about 3 Mauis, maybe like 1 Tremaine, 2 to 3 Medusas. Again, you can play around with these ratios depending on your metagame, I guess. Your locals, or if you're going to a bigger tournament, what you expect to see. Maui is in an interesting spot. It's still a very good card, but I think the value that you get off this card has definitely been reduced in these sets. It's weird to say that, but I don't know what it is. Maybe it's just like there's like every deck now has a way, or is engineered in a way, to generate advantage through getting their stuff challenged, right? Like you see Emerald Amethyst, which by the way was not represented at all, right? No Emerald decks in this top 8, but Emerald decks, Emerald Amethyst in particular, or just any Amethyst deck, being able to say, yeah, you challenge my stuff, I just have like a lot of passively self-generating advantage engines, right? Like the 1-drops replacing themselves. You challenge into my 1-drop Diablo or something, it replaces itself. Different cards like Docs, Clarabelles even, etc., to just generate advantage through their stuff getting challenged out. And I don't know if this makes sense or if I'm harping on this point for too long, and I apologize if I am, but I think the Maui really can be dissected in terms of, how much value do you still get out of this card, right? Because in testing, it still feels good when you drop it and you get advantage off of it, but also it can feel bad, and a lot of the time it's just ink because you're like, it's just not high value enough. It's really interesting. I'd rather have a targeted removal, take out a ready threat with Medusa or something. But yeah, this ratio is very interesting, and again, I think it can work, and obviously it did work for this player, which is great. We see 1 Elsa. I've tried to experiment with this, but not for very long. I didn't like it too much, but in theory it makes sense because just like I told you with Belle and Elsa, the Elsa comes down, challenges, it usually lives for the next turn, and either you Belle away the damage or you can shift Elsa because again your Elsa 5th Spirit has survived. So like in theory this is a really good card for this deck, and it can definitely buy you a turn. It can freeze the board, and it quests for 3 on the turn it's shifted. If you hard play this, right, it still just taps down 2 and then quests for 3 the following turn. It demands an answer. It's a very good card, and I think it's really overlooked right now. So it'll be interesting to see if this card does make its way into the meta for the national championship. But that being said, the reason why I ended up cutting this and not really valuing it too much in my testing is because, similar to what I mentioned in my Ruby Sapphire video where I talked about like playing Ratigan for the tap down versus Medusa, it's the same thing between Elsa and Sisu. I think I'd rather just play Sisu given how many low to the ground decks there are, and just blow people out with the Sisu because it's just a higher impact card. That being said, Elsa helps deal with Tamatoas and stuff on the opposing side, whereas Sisu doesn't, obviously, and other big threats that you might encounter. But that, again, like that being said, Ruby Amethyst has no problem dealing with Sapphire decks usually, right? So like you may not need the Elsa for those matchups, and for that reason I think like my rationale is I ended up cutting this, but I do think that this is a really good tech option, especially if you can make it work. And knowing the ins and outs of your deck and your matchups really help facilitate you knowing how to play this card correctly, because again it is a brick, right? Like you're playing a lot of top end bricks, 6 of them in total up here, and then of course 3 be prepared, so 9. If you end up with 2 to 3 of these cards in your opening hand, especially against a wheel deck, right, like Amber Steel Song, you're in trouble. But that being said, Ruby Amethyst has been able to push through a lot of bad hands before, just because of how powerful the Amethyst cards are with their ability to draw you through basically bad hands. So yeah, very interesting list. Overall, only 3 Brawl and 3 Be Prepareds, but yeah, I'm a fan overall of this list. Again, like I said, I've been experimenting with a different 1-drop package just because I don't want to have such a bad opening against Steel Song, but I'm glad to see that Ruby Amethyst in its traditional form, more or less, is still doing very, very well. All right, next up we've got Ruby Sapphire here. For Tipo, 3 Sisu Daring Visitor and 3 Ice Block. Okay, 4 and 4 on the Hiram and Gravitala. How far I'll go? 4, how far I'll go? That's a lot. Wow. 2 Maui, again, hero to all, and 3 Shark, as well as 3 Vitalospheres. So really valuing, it looks like, the Vitalosphere Shark interaction, 3 big Sisu, only 2 Tamatoa, which means, okay. So if you watch my Ruby Sapphire deep dive, if you watch the section I did on Lucky Dime and I talked about cutting Lucky Dime, this is what I mean, guys. Like, I don't know how to better explain it, but like the fact that this guy got second place in this big tournament without Lucky Dime and without relying on the Tamatoa interaction, I don't want to say proves my point, but like helps support what I'm saying. It's like the Lucky Dime Tamatoa just seems too slow now, and Ruby Sapphire really doesn't need it, because what you're aiming to do with this deck is control the game, and naturally through controlling the game you will just naturally start to quest out more than your opponent. The Sisu questing for 3, the Maleficent Dragon at 4 coming down and taking out a threat, questing for 2, being a hard body to out, you know, these things will naturally progress you to 20, whether or not your opponent's at 14, 16, 18. You're just constantly locking down the board. You don't need the dime. It's actually a tempo disruptor for you to pay 7 ink to play the dime and just be like, pass turn now, and your opponent gets another free turn because you wasted a turn playing the Lucky Dime. You're not on the fishbone ramp in order to like get to, you know, 15, 16 ink and you can play dime and play another interaction in a turn. The game is much faster now. So I really do respect, and I'm happy to see that this kind of validates my thinking a little bit in cutting the Lucky Dime. I'm glad this player had success with a deck like this. No shame in falling to Ruby Amethyst in the finals. It's a very tough matchup for a deck like this, but I really do like the concept of this deck. Not sure how I feel about the 2 Tamatoa. I would probably go with 3. But again, if you know your deck and you know what you're trying to facilitate here, like the 4 Maldragon is one I'm guessing you're primarily relying on. And just like I talked about in my Ruby Sapphire deep dive, between the Tipo, the Sail, and the How Far I'll Go, you're just looking to hit 2 ramp basically on your way from 1 to 6. They're not on Medusa, by the way, which is very interesting. How many uninkables total? 15. So yeah, they don't want to clutter up with too many uninkables. They're just going for straight high value. Sisu coming down early on probably turn 6 if they get the double ramp between turns 1 and 6, like I was mentioning in that deep dive video, is probably what they're aiming for. You can't reliably depend on shifting the Sisu, because again, if you've tested, you know, into the steel decks, the opponents will always target the Sisu because they know they fear the shift. So ramping to the Sisu makes sense, but also being able to go down on 7 ink to play the Shark and then trigger your Vitalosphere for Shark can be potentially a huge interaction. I've talked about Pirate's Life and its significance as well. I'm glad to see this player on 2. Again, something that I've talked about in my deep dive video. They're on 1 Hideaway, makes sense, helps combat those Queen's Castles, which can be, you know, a game-winning card against you. It still is ever since it was released. And then, yeah, 4 Visions, 4 Sail. Like, Visions, we've already talked about this card to death. It's such an amazing card. 4 Hiram, 4 Grandma. The 4 How Far I'll Go is very interesting, I will say. Like, I've experimented with 3 and I didn't like it. I thought it was too bricky and too slow, and I cut it to 2. But 4, you know, you're like, this just shows that you're just valuing. I just care about ramping. I care about ramping to those Maleficent Dragons is what I'm anticipating. Only 2 Be Prepared. Again, I talked about why this card is kind of been cut, because into the steel matchups, the Pete comes down and just locks this up. It buys the opponent another turn. You need to rely on the Sisu more than the Be Prepared at this point. I do like this list a lot, though. I'm very, very happy to see this list have success. I think it is good. I've talked about Shark potentially being too slow, but maybe this player cracked the code on it. Maybe the play is, or the efficient way to build it is just go high up on the Vitalospheres. You want to see this card at some point, and this is how you make Shark work better. Because this card is very good. This card being able to recur a Pirate's Life, help you ramp further with How Far I'll Go, so you can play those multiple interactions in a turn. It also gains you passive lore. It has evasive, so it deals with opposing genies. It's a big body. It's tough to out. It demands removal. It checks the aggro and the steel decks, especially if you get this out early. Like, if you're able to ramp once and get this out on turn 5 or even turn 4 because you double ramped, like, that can be really, really significant and a very hard check to a lot of decks. So yeah, I'm a big fan of this list, man. So congratulations. Sucks that you didn't win, Joey, but a great showing nonetheless. You really helped turn me on to some, you know, the cogs are turning in my head around Ruby Sapphire now. I kind of want to test that deck. I have not even looked at this one, but let's take a look at the Amethyst Sapphire. I would be interesting to see if this list lost to either the Ruby Amethyst or the Ruby Sapphire. I will say I've played against with my Ruby Amethyst. I think I played against 3 different Amethyst Sapphire decks, and I've beaten all of them. I think I only lost 1 match out of the 7 that I played in best of twos. Like, it seems like a very good matchup for you as the Ruby Amethyst player, whether you're on the player or on the draw. That being said, though, top 4 is nothing to scoff at. It's still a very good showing. But the reason I'm saying this is because I wouldn't be surprised if they just got beat by the Ruby Amethyst player. Like, Ruby Amethyst, this top 4 looks very, very good for Ruby Amethyst, right? Like, once they beat through the steel deck, the aggro deck, like, Ruby Amethyst, I would say, is favored into all of these decks in the top 4, right? So whatever got paired up against top 4 and top 2, it makes sense that this deck ended up winning. The hard part was beating the whichever steel deck it got paired up against in top 8. And Ruby Amethyst, the reason why it's so good is because, again, if it was on the play for its top 8 match into the steel deck, like, it's probably favored to win that match, right? So again, it would be interesting to know how the tournament ended up playing out in that regard. Anyways, on to this list, we see a total of 10 1-drops. The Chernobox of Diablos, the Broom. We've got the Madam Mim Snake, the Tipo on 2. Okay, so yeah, the Sapphire cards here, when we take a look, they're probably not too many, right? It's okay. We got the Donald, that's 6, 10. We're not playing Sale. Oh yeah, Sale 14, 15 Sapphire. So really, when you look at what the Sapphire cards are just there for ramp, right? Literally 3 out of the 5 different cards you play are all ramp. And then you're just playing a Hades, which isn't bad necessarily, but you don't really want to play Hades or Let It Go during a time where you're helping your opponent. Like, if you drop Hades on turn 6 because you're able to ramp, you're probably helping your opponent, but you might have to do it just because they're threatening lethal or something, and you just have to out their threat. What I will say is it's not as detrimental as it was before with the Hades, because as the format is faster, you're seeing these decks dump their hands out very, very quickly. And so giving an aggro deck an extra ink usually won't matter. Like, they're just going to play out their same 1 to 2 interactions in a turn once they get to this point in the game and their hand is almost depleted. So it is interesting to see that Hades does have a little bit more play into this meta. But yeah, let's go ahead and continue on reviewing the list here. Only 3 Crab, of course, 4 Fox, 4 Genie, 4 Goat, and 3 Rabbit. So the 4 Genie and 3 Rabbit, this is your card draw engine, right? Because, well, I guess you got 4 Friends as well, and then I guess the 1-drops. Okay, yeah, so you got the traditional, I guess, Amethyst card draw package at this point. 2 Belle, 4 Elsa, of course, 3 Donald. So if you can do something like Tipo or Sail into the Donald, that gets you a Hades on turn 5, an Elsa on turn 6 on the hard cast, so not too bad. And then, of course, because you're redrawing so much with the Amethyst package, once you get up there in the ink, you can probably start playing multiple interactions in a turn. The one thing I will say about Amethyst Sapphire from my experience is this deck can seem like just you're panicking, because once you get into that mid to late game, you're really dependent on things like the Madam Mim Fox for clutching out key interactions for you. Again, this is just my experience, and maybe I wasn't playing against the best Amethyst Sapphire pilots, but once you get to a point in the game, like, if you're able to clean up their board and you just go wide against them, like, there's nothing that they can really do, right? Because they don't have any board wipes. Like, they have to rely on the Elsa and the Hades, and they have to rely on them going wider than you in order for them to win the game. And if you have any kind of board wipes, so again, if you're on just any kind of Ruby deck, you do check them kind of hard. What I will say is, when you look at their deck, though, the Snake, the Fox, the Crab, the Goats, and the Goat is a problem in this format, because these are the cards that dodge the Sisu wipe, the Belle, this Donald, and then your top end Elsa and Hades. The thing, the sad part about Hades too is, against the Ruby Sapphire matchups, like, Hades and Donald are easy targets for, and the Crab and Snake for the ice block to make them susceptible to the big Sisu. The harder cards to out are the Goat, the Madam Mim, and the Elsa, but that's very thin, right, when you look at it. So this is probably why this deck maybe fell off in the top 4, is because it just struggled into those Ruby and or other Sapphire decks that just had better removal options. But this is a fun deck for sure. And, you know, when you go up against steel decks, I think that this deck does very, very well into steel. And so that's probably why, like, yeah, they beat a steel in the top 8 for sure, right? But in Swiss rounds, I think that's maybe why this deck did well. I think I haven't played. I played a bit of Emerald Amethyst, and I haven't really played Amethyst Sapphire too much. I've played like maybe just a couple matches, but I never played Amethyst Sapphire into Emerald Amethyst, to my knowledge that I can remember. But I think that the Amethyst Sapphire deck might be a little favored into the Emerald Amethyst matchup. Um, and I mean, maybe I'm not going to try to explain that in this video, but I do know that at the Charlie's Collectible show, the Emerald Amethyst deck, I believe somebody said, was the most registered deck at that tournament out of the 200 plus players. And none of the Amethyst decks made top 8, right? I don't believe, at the CCS 10K, because the Steel decks just ate them for free. But yeah, and again, no Emerald here in the top 8. So before we move on to the Steel decks, I want to take a look at this Ruby Sapphire. Okay, this guy's on the Queen of Hearts. This is a card that I really I don't want to say hyped up, but, you know, really talked about in my deep dive of Ruby Sapphire, being a card to help facilitate the plays into the aggro decks, or give you more play into the aggro decks. But that being said, you know, the second place list, the 4 How Far All Goes, just going all in on Shark with the Vitalosphere, I think that might be a nice alternative way to play this player. Again, on a slower build, the Greystone Dragon, the Lucky Dime. So in the mirror match, you know, they might be more favored because of that. 3 Tamatoas, 3 Dragon, 3 Sisu. They're on the Medusas. How many Uninkables total? 16. Okay. 3 of the small Sisu and 3 Ice Blocks. 2 Be Prepared. So yeah, just, you know, these are the things we've talked about already. The 2 Be Prepared to 3 Sisu seems to be the accepted ratio. Whether or not you play Medusa is on you. I have struggled in deciding on whether or not I do want to play Medusa or just go all in on the Dragons. You know, I do like that second place list though. I just the uninkability of Medusa, and into aggro decks, she does seem a little underwhelming. Like, yes, she can hit something that's high value, but I need more significant like push, and I think I'd rather just go all in on the Sisu just for the wider coverage of taking out multiple threats rather than pinging down some like one thing. So I opted to cut Medusa to 1 in my list, and I like that. The 2 can seem a little clunky for me personally. But overall, a decent list. The 1, Let It Go with the with the double Shark for recurability, with the 1 Pirate's Life, sure. On the 3, Hero to All, yeah, still an acceptable list. See, like for me, I would build my list more like this personally, but I actually do like the second place list more now that I see that what was his name, Joey's list. But yeah, congratulations to Jonathan Williams showing up and doing well. I would, yeah, if I built Ruby Sapphire, I think my list is almost similar to this one actually, more or less, right? I think I may cut 1 Vitalisaur for a Potion of Might and go up more on the ratio of Queen of Hearts, cut 1 Medusa. I cut Hideaway from mine, but again, that's just because, you know, I don't see locations too much on my testing. But if you are afraid of the locations, the 1 Hideaway is definitely something you can value. Yeah, this is this one. I'm a fan of the second place list more, but I would definitely build my list like Jonathan's, which is weird. But let's go ahead and switch over to the top 8 now.